Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Alex, for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about my research in Flint. I have been doing 7 years of ethnographic research so far, building off of that experience in the Red Cross. And some of that research, so I'm going to talk about the Flint water crisis. I'm also going to talk about the United Auto Workers Union in Flint. Flint was the birthplace of the UAW. I'm really going to try to draw the union a little more into this story of the water crisis and maybe build a bigger picture of Flint for you that way. And maybe that'll give you some context for some of the environmental issues we're maybe are more present in our minds when we think of Flint today. And this picture is actually from fieldwork I did in 2019. So there was a month-long strike at General Motors, GM. And yeah, I did fieldwork during the strike, which I can maybe talk about in the Q&A later if you're interested. So ethnography, if you're not familiar, it's a qualitative research method. It involves being really immersed in a place, talking to people. So that can be doing interviews or what we call participant observation, just being really, really immersed in everyday life. And today I'm actually going to talk about fatigue. And I'm going to get into kind of several senses and meanings of fatigue. As it's related to the water crisis. And also, if you go back in Flint's union history, there actually is a history there about fatigue. I'm going to try to think about it as a political tool, as a starting point for social change. Not always, but sometimes. And it's a way to use a very personal condition to, critique a societal crisis, right? Or even technology. But before I get into that, just to give you a very quick background, if you've never heard of the Flint water crisis before, let me just orient us a bit. So Flint is in Michigan. It's a city in Michigan. It's in the Midwest. The water crisis began there in 2016 when it came to light that Flint's drinking water had very, very high levels of lead. I'm sure many of you know lead is a really dangerous toxin. It can affect cognition. It can disrupt and damage different organs in the body. So this was, a very serious crisis. Lead is actually not new to Flint. So a chemist at General Motors actually invented leaded gasoline, and that really helped make cars more profitable and competitive. And Flint's nickname is Vehicle City, as you can see here. That's because this is where General Motors started. This is also where the UAW started in the 30s. So GM was kind of starting to produce cars in the 1900s. The union doesn't come along until the 1930s. There's kind of a variety of factors to that. So it was a very friendly climate in the 30s legally, for it was legal to unionize in some ways that it hadn't before. And there was, the Great Depression was also going on. So there was also this sort of pressure, maybe almost like being pushed to the limit that a lot of people were experiencing. So I think these different things came together in that time period to make the UAW happen. But we'll get into some more of that later. And while Flint once was a very prosperous, very productive place because of GM, GM changed the way it ran as a company. So it relocated kind of towards the end of the 20th century. A lot of jobs producing cars get moved to non-unionized parts of the world. So the US South, the global South. And today, Flint is kind of now mostly known for sort of huge amounts of abandoned land, abandoned factories, abandoned houses, that kind of thing. So this had been the situation for, about a decade or more when the Flint water crisis enters the picture. So Flint is in really bad economic shape. In 2016, the city decides to switch the water to save money, but the entire system becomes contaminated with lead. And this decision, it's actually really important to understand it happened under a system called emergency management. So an emergency manager is an official who is appointed, not elected, to make decisions. They're especially assigned to cities that are struggling financially. So their priority is to get the finances back in order. So none of the locally elected representatives, none of the residents really had a say on whether this water would be switched and what would happen to the drinking water. So this is obviously a fairly non-democratic system of governance. It's also a pretty racist system. So in Michigan, a very high proportion of majority Black cities, and Flint is a majority Black city, those are very often put under emergency management, even when their sort of majority white counterpart cities are not. They might have similar financial issues, but they do not get this type of governance. And this picture, this is a picture of a pipe, just to give you an example. This is a more extreme example of some of the damage. Not every pipe looked like this, but you can see they're basically corroded and crumbling. And this was kind of triggered chemically by switching Flint's water supply from one of the Great Lakes, Lake Huron, to the Flint River. And there's some big differences between these bodies of water. The river is it's in a much more urban environment. It also had been, a place where waste had been deposited. But especially in the present day, it had been filled with actually road salt because, like here in Michigan, we have really long, hard winters and the roads are salted, right, to make it safer for cars to drive on. And this salt all eventually runs off into the river, right, into the water. And this increases chloride levels. The chloride levels make the water more corrosive. This is what makes the water crisis start happening because some of the pipes are lead, they haven't been updated. And the corrosivity kind of strips the pipes of lead and it gets it flowing into homes, into people's bodies as they drink this water. So all this infrastructure for road, like for cars, these roads, these salted roads came into tension in the Flint water crisis with this human infrastructure, right? This infrastructure for sustaining human life. And I think it's, that's one of the smaller details, but it does capture something about Flint's relationship to the car and to car production, that history. It's been very ambivalent. Now, a few months into the water switch, GM actually decided to stop using Flint water and connect to a different water source because they were actually finding that the water was corroding their engine parts in their factories. And that was one of the first signs that there's high chloride levels and a sign that maybe there's something more serious wrong, but this would not be addressed for about another year and people would still be drinking the water even after GM had decided it wasn't going to work for their industrial process. And this was kind of ironic, right? Because GM factories for decades had deposited heavy metals. They dissolved solvents, volatile organic compounds, all kinds of waste that's actually not necessarily well documented. It's been very under-regulated, very under-reported on. So this is a picture you can kind of hopefully make out. This factory no longer exists, but it was you can see how close it is to the Flint River. And this is where we also get into a kind of interesting example about the relevance of kind of everyday cultural knowledge that being anthropologists study, and the really serious issues with emergency management, right? Because, anyone who lives in Flint just knows like that river water is not good to drink. That's not safe. And they might not have a scientific report to hand to you that might not even exist, but Flint was a company town for so long, everybody kind of has a personal connection to GM, right? Like their family, their friends, their neighbors worked, and it's this kind of open secret, right? That either on purpose or by accident, materials are getting into that river that don't belong there. And, something you notice actually, if you talk to people in Flint about the Flint River is they joke about it a lot. So they'll say like, don't go fishing in there, like watch out for the dead bodies in there, so there's kind of this like dark humor, like just watch out. And, from an anthropological point of view, you could, look at this as, a joke. Okay, that's not that serious. That's not what we would call data, but there was really, really crucial knowledge, right? That was lost because actually emergency management is a system where people aren't participating in democracy. People, it's much deeper than even like voting, like one person, one vote. There's kind of a whole loss of this very locally embedded, almost tacit, like knowledge you don't even know that you have, but you've acquired kind of culturally. So I think that's something really important to pay attention to in Flint and elsewhere. So after the water crisis comes to light, a lot of donations start pouring in of bottled water. And this is something I did a lot of field work around. So people from all over the country started sending, bringing, dropping off these bottles of water. And it's actually been 8 years of this now. This has continued. So this is kind of a new normal. Like the levels of trust are still so fraught that bottled water is still very much a part of everyday life in Flint, even as the pipes. I mean, that is not an overnight thing to fix, right? The pipes, even though those have been being repaired and replaced, bottled water is still very important to many, many people. So there are these sites around the city called pods. I'm going to call them pods. That's just short for point of distribution. And Flint residents actually kind of run these pods, and the water is donated by Nestle. Nestle is a multinational corporation. They extract hundreds and thousands of gallons of water, groundwater from Michigan, actually, in rural Michigan. They bottle this water, they sell it. This has actually drawn a lot of criticism from environmentalist groups, from politicians in the Midwest and the Great Lakes. So this water, it's sold in the Midwest under the label of Ice Mountain. You probably have seen it in like under Poland Spring, I think is the one here in New England, but that's Nestle too. So when I was doing field work, I was going a couple times a week to these distribution centers, these pods. And by doing field work here, I got very, very in tune to the kind of rhythm, the everyday practice of doing this distribution work. So that's where some of the material in this talk comes from, is those experiences, how this all played out on a very everyday level. So the water would be delivered in bulk pallets, and volunteers would have to unpack and load these into cars. The cases would weigh 30 pounds. The lines of people to get water would be very, very long. So this is a video, hopefully I can get it to play, but this is a video I took in 2019, and it just gives you a sense of how many people are coming. So about 500 people came, and that's actually still a very small portion of Flint's total population. But these cars would start lining up as early as 4 a.m. The water would start being distributed at 10 a.m. So people would try to get there really, really early. So yeah, even though the pods didn't reach everybody, people would come again and again. They'd often pick up for other people. And it's actually very difficult to sort of access the bottled water if you don't have a car. So the car comes up again. You know, Flint is very unfriendly to pedestrian travel. It's very much not a place where there's public transportation. It's not built for that. So this is another kind of crucial thing. It was a huge accessibility issue, right? So people would often come and, you know, pick up on behalf of people who don't have a car, don't have gas money. This is a big part of getting water. Also throughout this, so these are donations from Nestle, as I mentioned, there would often be talk while I was doing field work, and before this, there would always be sort of deadlines thrown out there, like, we're going to stop, this is just an emergency, this is just, you know, disaster relief, but this isn't going to be a permanent thing. And it was always very arbitrary. It was never like, for as long as I've been sort of doing work in Flint, I've never known the bottled water to stop being distributed or stop being free, but this did kind of manufacture this sense of like anxiety and scarcity and uncertainty, right? So this was extremely difficult on top of everything else. Flint's recycling systems were also weighed down by these sort of thousands of pounds of plastic that come from using these bottles. And in some cases, this has actually led to interesting projects. So an artist named Mel Chin, this was in 2018, I believe, he reached out to community groups and he wanted to recycle the bottles, and residents collected them. They put it in a huge semi truck. It was driven to North Carolina. and I believe this is in North Carolina, actually. It was sort of broken down into pellets, melted, turned into a sort of thread, I think, of some kind of fiber, and then a fashion designer came in and volunteers, or actually it was a paid position. People in Flint then sort of sewed raincoats, and like it's like a very plasticky material, obviously. So this actually went up in a museum in Queens, in New York. So this was a pretty interesting, pretty creative, resourceful example, but most of the plastic waste that comes into Flint, it kind of doesn't get channeled into these more interesting projects. Most of it just becomes trash, essentially. And there's a video here. This is actually a video from Flint Fit, the project. People talking about the garbage, how it's become almost part of the landscape. And this is another kind of heavy reality that is, much bigger even than the plastic bottles in Flint. This idea that, there's these aesthetics around Flint and the Rust Belt in general, as a very degraded, deteriorating place, and people really struggle with how that is represented. Often Flint is represented very one-dimensionally. So there's a lot of nuance, right, and difficulties around that. So this is all to say bottled water has introduced a lot of unpredictability, a lot of stress in life in Flint. This was actually really brought home one day in a kind of very memorable meeting or hearing, actually, that I went to. And a resident, this was a civil rights hearing about the water crisis, and a resident brought a case of water, and he asked the commissioners to take turns holding it. And he was talking about how he wanted them to feel what it's like to lift a case of water, and he wanted them to try to imagine what it's like to do that, every day, many times a day, maybe for the rest of your life. And so what you're seeing in the pictures are the commissioners kind of struggling to take turns with these cases. And, this was a very simple action and gesture, but the awkwardness of it, the slowness, how slow and uncomfortable it was to do it, really sent a powerful message. And it really sent the message, like, the weight of this water and the weight of the water crisis it's physically, it's very heavy. It's also emotionally very heavy and very charged. So this is maybe a more dramatic example, but there are many, many sort of more everyday sentiments about fatigue that I heard in field work, which made me curious about fatigue, and it made me want to take it more seriously, right? It's something that is not always, it's not the most obvious thing to look at maybe, but it came up enough in my field work in a more mundane way that I became really curious, like what is it about fatigue, and is there a history maybe? And I did think about Flint's history and fatigue as political critique. Like, I think this is an example of fatigue as a political critique, and that's not necessarily new. So one of the major parts of Flint's identity is the UAW that I mentioned at the beginning, so the United Auto Workers Union. And they began in the 30s with this really famous event called the sit-down strike. This is a super famous, in Flint, it's like one of the most, positive parts of Flint's history for a lot of residents. So a lot of people I met actually had family who had been part of the strike. So some of it was family history. The sit-down strike was basically union organizers got the workers to go on strike. And instead of walking out, or instead of forming a picket line, they actually just sat down. So they occupied the factory, and this meant that GM couldn't make cars, they couldn't bring in replacement workers. So they're occupying this factory. It's about 40 days. It's in the winter, and GM even cuts the heat off at one point. And the strikers are just living there 24/7, and their families, their wives, and neighbors are bringing them food, and it's this huge community event, and it's, the whole world is watching, and they do win, eventually, and that's what starts, they're recognized officially by GM. And this is a picture of UAW today in Flint, and if you can see on the sign, it actually says, home of the sit-downers. So this is a huge, huge thing that people in Flint are proud of, even if they're not in the union. And here you can see a monument. This is actually across the street from some of the factories in Flint. And it's just, you know, the sit-down strike cast into statues. And there is a tradition as well called White Shirt Day. And this is a commemoration of the sit-down strike that auto workers do. And I'll read a description from the website, a UAW website, that quotes this idea, this tradition of wearing a white shirt on the anniversary comes from the 40s. So a worker suggested this idea. He felt that by wearing white shirts into work that day, which were traditionally worn by management, we would show that we were as good as white collar workers. And also when management walked up and down the factory floor and saw everyone wearing white shirts, it would demonstrate the strength and unity of UAW workers, as well as the dignity of all UAW working men and women. So, you know, why did the sit-down strike have such symbolic resonance? You know, why there's statues, there's memorials, there's rituals around it in Flint, like even to this day. You know, what inspired it? And actually, I think there's a science and technology story that's relevant here. And I learned about this from Robin Scheffler at MIT, who has this article, a really, really cool article about the Harvard Fatigue Lab. Here's another statue. And this lab was trying to define fatigue, or was trying to understand it kind of physiologically. And they recruited, it started in the 20s. It was in the basement of Harvard Business School, and they would kind of get these college students, and they would get athletes actually to walk on treadmills. I don't know if you can make, this is actually a treadmill, that they're trying to do these experiments and decide, like settle on a definition of what is fatigue. Can you identify it somehow in somebody's, you know, sort of physical reactions, right? And they were trying to do this holistically, you know, looking at the whole body. What was just really fascinating to me about the experiments was that it was on a treadmill. And, you know, this is a very crucial piece of technology, because while they're doing these experiments, the conveyor belt is also going into other contexts and becoming very important. It's in the auto industry, right? So I'm sure you've heard of like the assembly line. And this is a quote from Robin's article. So he talks about how the treadmill provided a potent icon of this new way of considering labor. Manufacturers such as Ford adopted conveyor belt-driven assembly lines in the 1920s. Both treadmill and belt aimed to reduce discretion of the individual to set their own pace, and to one of two choices: keep up or fall out. So Henry Ford, you know, kind of introduces this. GM puts in an assembly line in 1926. You know, when Henry Ford does it, it cuts the time of making a Model T from 12 hours to 90 minutes. There's a lot of accounts, kind of firsthand accounts or literature about, like, from the worker's perspective, this is a very alienating experience. It's very de-skilling. You know, you're just working on one repetitive part and you're not really connected to the whole process. Although you can also read a lot of examples of how people kind of, I guess you would say, gamed the system sometimes and kind of interrupted the monotony. So there's like really good memoirs like Rivet Head by Ben Hamper that talks about how they kind of, you know, play around with it or even kind of sabotage the machines. But anyways, General Motors installs the assembly line in 1926. A decade later, the sit-down strike will happen. And the speed of the assembly line and the fact that over time, they were trying to speed up that process gradually is really one of the driving issues of the sit-down strike. So workers just didn't go along with this. They didn't just decide to keep up with it. They decided to push back against that speed. And I want to share this quote from a social scientist from Flint, actually. And he points out something really interesting. He writes, Flint's great sit-down strike was rooted in the pain experienced by the bodies of the industrial working class, and what labor historians generally refer to as the most important labor battle in American history. Money was not, as might be expected, the main issue that pitted the United Auto Workers in a struggle against GM. Rather, it was the speed up, the exhausting pace of work that made weariness, silence, even retching a commonplace experience after a stint in the factory. So this is a really striking claim. Basically the priority here was not even necessarily money and wages at first, but just the speed and the fatigue of their bodies, something very, very basic. And that was the tipping point, right? So coming back forward in time, to think about the water crisis now and the pods and like the physical experience of living with bottled water. So I've talked kind of about a very, straightforward, like way of feeling tired, right? And doing this kind of work. But there's also a specific phrase I wanted to talk about called, there's a saying sort of going around called Flint fatigue. And I think it's maybe similar, maybe you've heard of things like compassion fatigue or climate fatigue, or like, I guess the most recent one is COVID fatigue. So this idea that, like, for example, if there's any humanitarian disaster, people start to get tired of hearing about it and donations stop coming or attention stops coming. So I think Flint fatigue is touching on some of that, but I think it's a little different as well. I'm still kind of thinking about it myself, but there's this quote here. The meaning of Flint fatigue has actually changed over time, which I think is interesting because at first, at the beginning of the crisis, when there was a lot of attention, it was actually used mostly by professionals. It was used by people like social workers or anyone in a kind of caretaking, people-centered profession would use this to say that Flint residents are actually experiencing water crisis fatigue. And sometimes they were getting really redundant, like phone calls or visits or like resources. And it was just like, people were shutting down because it was actually just too much. But then, this sort of attention and urgency starts to fade away. And now it kind of means something different. So in this quote, this is a local writer, and he says, "A while ago, I heard that some Lansing is the capital, legislators had started tossing around a new term, Flint fatigue. They were tired of hearing about the city and its ills proceeding from the water crisis. Tell me about it. I too am tired of hearing about the water crisis, and I'm tired of talking about it. Flint fatigue is real. Ask anyone who lives in Flint." And what I find so interesting about this quote is that Flint residents are experiencing Flint fatigue here, but they're also pointing out that there's this almost feedback loop. Like, it's actually coming from, there's these people in power who are tired of hearing about it. And the more tired they get of hearing about it, the more tired Flint residents are going to get of talking about it. And I think there's something incredibly difficult. This is capturing something really difficult about living in a crisis that is going on now for 8 years. And this is another quote. A writer talks about visiting Flint. So this writer is not from Flint, and he talks about being surprised about hearing about Flint fatigue. And he says, it's amplified the real costs of the crisis. Listening to a group of Flint pastors reflect recently on their experiences, I was struck they carried the additional burden of lobbying for themselves, of pleading with institutions to remember them in their ongoing struggles, of educating strangers about what it's like on streets and in homes. I asked one pastor whether she was tired of telling people about her experience of the water crisis. Yes, she said, but those of us from Flint don't have a choice. So I think the phenomenon of this Flint fatigue and the saying was really important, and it points to how difficult it is to get attention on Flint and this kind of idea that there's almost a way Flint gets overlooked and there's amnesia about Flint. And I guess the interesting question for me kind of as a researcher is why is this? Why do people get tired or, get tired of hearing about crisis? And I think it is important to remember Flint actually has a really long history, even before the water crisis, of being really represented as a place that's struggling and in crisis, with GM leaving, with, people moving away, and Flint becoming this sort of, like the picture I showed earlier, like empty land, deteriorating land. And this has become the main way people think about Flint. And the sort of where the responsibility for that crisis is placed is very, very political. Residents are constantly trying to distinguish between what are the structural causes of inequality and toxicity, instead of that blame being put back on individuals or on local behavior. And, For example, part of what led to the emergency management system being put in was this idea, and it was a very racialized narrative, that Flint couldn't take care of itself. So, the way Flint was failed by government, failed by industry in the past, has sometimes really been collapsed into just talking about Flint as a failure. And residents are very, aware of that distinction. And so I think part of the lesson to draw from Flint fatigue is, where do we get this comfort almost even if it's unconscious, to sort of overlook or forget about or stigmatize places like Flint and the Rust Belt. And I think it's important to ask, what is it about deindustrialization? Going even deeper than just the water crisis, what is so hard about that? And if we can only think about places like Flint and post-industrial places as like an extreme, toxic, unlivable landscape, we're kind of falling into a trap that like a place can either be totally safe or totally dangerous. And we know like ecologies don't work like that at all, right? There's not this rigid distinctions. So I'm going to wrap up here, but just one point to take away from this talk is fatigue. The way we talk about fatigue, whether it's in kind of sayings, everyday sayings like this, or in a laboratory, in a kind of scientific mode, the way we talk about fatigue has political consequences. And one of the interesting things I found doing field work, going back to the sit-down strike and the way the sit-down strike is remembered, it's this huge shared kind of symbol in Flint, but it is remembered differently by different communities. So when I spoke to UAW people, they tend to relate to the idea that's connected to that white shirt day I mentioned. So they remember the strike as being about upward class mobility and becoming sort of more equal to GM and being like on the same level at the bargaining table. And water activists also refer to the sit-down strike a lot, but they have a slightly different takeaway from it, I guess. So they really focus on the part where it was a fight, and it was like this huge injustice that needed to be corrected. And it was a fight against exploitation that could kind of parallel the way people in Flint are fighting against emergency management or against these other, systems that have produced the water crisis. So the sit-down strike was really a way to kind of spark, like reignite that emotional investment. Like Flint is worth fighting for. Everyone doesn't care about Flint. They have Flint fatigue. It doesn't matter. It's worth fighting it. Like we've done it before. We'll do it again. And, we'll make sacrifices for Flint. So it's not to say like these are kind of two different readings I'm sort of pulling out. It's not to say they are really fundamentally at odds with each other. And like for many people, I think they overlap actually, but there are still, the story, there's variance in how the story gets told of the sit-down strike. So with the water crisis, the emphasis is on fighting injustice, exploitation. For the UAW, it's more of a story of making peace with GM. So there's some interesting contrast there to unpack, but I think I'll leave it at that. I'd love to get into questions about anything you might want to know about Flint that I couldn't cover, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Elena, so much. As people are gathering questions, I have a comment and a question. This is no flattery. This was one of the most thought-provoking talks I've heard in a long time, if only because it seems like putting fatigue on the table seems to me. I started labor and environment to the pivotal issue of our time, but it actually does feel to me like in a profound way, fatigue is, and how we grapple with fatigue and push beyond fatigue around environmental matters seems like it needs to be a center of thinking. And perhaps it is amongst student activists, but the whole time you were talking, I just started going back to I started teaching here in 2013 at Tufts, and I'm writing down names none of the students will know because it's 10 years ago. Will Pearl, Dan Jubilaire, these incredibly committed activists that were trying to push Tufts to divest from fossil fuels, something that we knew in 2013 was inevitable. They were going to do it, but the politics of bureaucracy, the university and so forth was that they were going to drag it out. They were going to create fatigue. I think about being a graduate student. Sorry, this is turning into a long comment. I just think about being a grad student in 2006 at the University of Chicago when we were fighting to kick Taco Bell off campus because they wouldn't recognize the Coalition of Immokalee workers' demand for an extra penny a pound for tomatoes. We did it in 1 year. We kicked Taco Bell off campus in 1 year. Can you imagine doing that today? Right? It would be stalled out, dragged out. And I just think all the students and student activists I've moved through, that by the end of their 4 years were tired, right? They were exhausted from trying to do what is obvious and necessary and will happen. And so thinking about just the cultivation of fatigue and generating, like, how do we push beyond fatigue and fight, is just a really important opening conversation. So thank you. I have a much simpler question beyond that comment, which is just that I was really struck from the opening figure of how you tied together the ways that emergency management and bringing in people from outside with no local knowledge itself is pivotal to the water crisis. And perhaps I'm just ignorant of the Flint situation, but has that been picked up and circulated more broadly, that this is a major issue if we're going to continue sending struggling communities into emergency management? Has the connection been made that it's precisely the emergency managers' ignorance of local ecologies and issues that led to this crisis?
No, that's a great question. Yes and no. The law still exists, so there hasn't been a kind of uprooting of it as a, acceptable, legitimate way to handle post-industrial, or, for whatever reason, a community struggling with poverty. Flint isn't under emergency management right now. That stopped with the beginning of the water crisis, and the mayor, city council are back to their sort of normal functioning. But a lot of the activism, there's a really great ethnography about the water crisis by Ben Pauley called Flint Fights Back. And that is a great place to read about how he kind of argues, or he kind of shows how the water crisis happened in the context of this bigger crisis, right, of emergency management that people in Flint were already well aware of as problematic and pushing back against it. And he kind of shows how there was already a community, almost like a social infrastructure of people who, had seen this emergency management. It had started in kind of early 2000s. So this had been something Flint was dealing with for a long time and critiquing, protesting, like very much drawing attention to. And yeah, I mean, it took the water crisis in a way to even redress that democracy issue. So this democracy and water crisis kind of intersected in Flint. But yeah, I recommend, this ethnography. It's by a political scientist. So he really does get into the mechanics of governance that were going on.
Any questions?
Thank you, Elena. That was really informative. I think I used the fatigue term also stuck with me, because I feel this is something that happens every day all over the country in different magnitude of environmental mini or macro disasters. So I think it is problematic, because I think the result is that the residents typically end up just living there and because they cannot do anything else but just deal with it. So I was wondering a bit more about the residents in Flint. I wanted to know more about who are the people who are pushing this to fight against that fatigue, because after 8 years, I can imagine they are running on fumes. Who are the leaders in the communities? What type of groups? And also, I was wondering about the role of GM. From the talk, it was not really clear. I mean, clearly they are a contributor to the pollution of the Flint River. I'm not sure how much they contribute to the actual event that unfolded, but I wanted to know what type of responsibility have they assumed to their community, how they are responding to make the life for Flint residents better.
Great questions. Yeah, well, to start with the GM question, no, GM was, to clarify it, GM was not directly kind of polluting the water in the situation of the Flint water crisis. So I mentioned they stopped using the water, right? But yeah, you could make a historical argument for sure that the Flint River, that there is a history there, that GM deposited waste there, and so it wasn't a safe source of water. But how has GM assumed responsibility? I mean, there's a lot of brownfields, so like kind of toxic factory land. A lot of the factory buildings have been demolished. GM, so when GM kind of went bankrupt and then sort of reinvented itself, they kind of have this trust where they will hold the land, and they've sort of promised to clean it up, or, you know, at least oversee cleaning it up, and they're trying to sell it basically. And it's kind of an interesting open question. I mean, you can't zone that industrial land, you know, for people to live in, or at least it's not immediately apparent what you would do other than just put another heavy industry there. So these are all kind of open questions in Flint. But yeah, I would say, like, in general, GM is not exactly part of the picture, you know, of taking some kind of environmental responsibility. And then your other question, I think, was about who were the people kind of pushing, you know, maybe pushing through the fatigue to some extent. You know, I think it really depends on people's life histories in a way. And I think kind of what I was trying to think about with the union, and the union being so embedded in the life of Flint. So many water crisis activists, you know, even if they're not part of a union right now, some of them have been, you know, they've organized, you know, in the shop floor before. They know what it's like to sort of take a grievance and sort of mediate conflicts and that kind of thing through the UAW. So I think that's certainly not the only experience somebody can have, but I do think that experience matters to, you know, if somebody was already kind of had an activated political subjectivity, I think, you know, there's a skill, right, to pushing through fatigue. And I think it's one you kind of learn, and, you know, that I think anyone can learn, but it's hard.
Sorry, I'm just moving a mic around.
Thank you so much for kind of bringing to the forefront of my mind this thing that I think everybody knows about, but doesn't really know a lot about what's going on with it now. And I actually went to my freshman year at Alma College, which is down the road for some East Coasters from Flint in Michigan. Do the mutton middle of the hand. I think that one of the things that was really surprising to me, a lot of my environmental studies science education there was about groundwater, from the geologist who was my advisor. And we were working on like a water budget plan with the county because one didn't exist. And it was really, really interesting to like be college students, basically like informing policy, because a lot of meetings that we'd had with, or that the school had with the local EPA brushed off a lot of like the non-point source pollution of like the CAFOs in the area. And sorry for all the jargon, like basically there's a lot of pig farms as well as other brownfield sites. And one of Michigan's kind of like prides is Pure Michigan. I don't know if anybody's seen those Pure Michigan ads on YouTube or on TV. So my question is more about like PR and like in fatigue and PR, and like how you have found that kind of those Pure Michigan ads, or how fatigue helps PR of politicians, not just of Flint, but of the state, and how like there's been so many controversies in Michigan politically, and how those have kind of like helped to bury the crisis that is still ongoing. Apologies for it not being such a pointed question, but those are all the thoughts that are kind of swirling around my head. It's such a great
Thank you.
talk.
No,
Yeah.
that's such a great question. I mean, I'm definitely going to think about that more. I haven't necessarily tied those things like fatigue and the Pure Michigan together, but I'm totally picking up on what you're saying. And it makes me think of activists. So in Flint and Detroit, there's, you know, the water toxicity crisis. There's also a huge water affordability crisis. So there's just been this history of water issues. And I think what you're kind of pointing at is like, there is this history of parts of Michigan being sort of, you know, the the landscape or, the regions have been sort of almost diametrically opposed. So like up north is like a beautiful place to go on vacation, and like there's water and waterfalls and lakes, and the pure Michigan is the symbol of that. And that's very much in opposition to like the southeastern part of the state, which is where like the car factories are, and where and there's racial divisions, right? So whether or not it's true or not, there's Flint and Detroit are associated with being like majority Black cities. And I mean, they are, but up north is sort of coded as more of a white place, and that plays into it, and kind of the racial injustice side of that story. But I mean, what you talked about, it made me think of PFAS, which is a chemical that has been coming up in Michigan a lot. I don't know if you've encountered it here. It gets into water. I mean, it's very persistent. That's kind of its defining quality. It's been used to like fight fires. So there was a military base in sort of up north or in very rural Michigan. And I remember people talking about, okay, like you're a farmer, I'm somebody in Flint, our lives are very different. We live in different places, but we're connecting on this water issue. Like water, we don't want PFAS, in our water. We don't want people to get PFAS fatigue, or we want this to, have the urgency and not be dismissed and overlooked. So yeah, I think it's very complicated, but I think it's, really important to unpack. And there is potential solidarity there, but it's not easy.
Just 1 second.
Hi. So I was wondering, since you grew up in the area near Flint, how you decided to kind of stick with that issue and stay in the area, and whether that caused fatigue for you personally, and how that has developed now that you're doing similar research, but much further away in a completely different setting with people who are not as familiar with this crisis and those feelings.
That's a great question. Yeah, so I didn't talk so much about my kind of like personal background in this talk, but I was at the Red Cross when it started, and it's happened at the same time. I knew I wanted to go to grad school. I was interested in like social issues, environmental issues, and cultural anthropology. So I did bring those things together. And yeah, absolutely, I've experienced fatigue, at the personal level of, thinking about working with a project for so long. It can be hard to sort of sustain that and to think about, remember, what are the stakes here? I think like a lot of long-term projects are like that, but with Flint, it's also, I think, it can be hard I found myself sometimes struggling to talk about the water crisis, because I think, people always want to know, is it over? Are the pipes fixed? What's happening now? And it's because I've spent so long thinking about it, it's very hard to begin to answer that question. But I think that can be a good thing, potentially. I think it can be a good thing because it forces me to slow down and not try to make the story simpler than it is. I guess that would kind of be something that I think is important. That comes out of, being in grad school, but also just living in a place where this is ongoing for 8 years. And, how do you explain that and all the multiple causes and multiple inequalities that are part of that? Fatigue is definitely part of it, but it can also kind of stop us from trying to, have too easy of an answer.
Hi, my name is Caleb Scoville. I teach environmental sociology, and one of the topics we cover is environmental justice in my course. And that work often is, of course, there's a lot of really great work under that moniker, but a lot of it is really focused on explaining unequal exposure. And something I really appreciated about your work is it kind of goes beyond a lot of the sort of familiar tropes within that research to kind of, it seems like you're edging toward a kind of political theory of environmental justice and injustice. And one of the things that was really interesting to me about your talk was the connections that you were drawing between labor mobilization and mobilization or responses to water, the water poisoning. With respect to fatigue, though, it seemed that with the labor, there's a disruptive potential to fatigue, right? Fatigue, as in that sort of symbolic of, there's a sitting down, the sort of, they look sort of like they might be bosses in a certain sense. They're reading the newspaper, they have their hats on. And I was wondering sort of what sort of potentials come out of fatigue in the case of sort of water users, right? Fatigue in some instances you mentioned was an obstacle, something to be pushed through. In other cases, it was mobilized, where you sort of showed I think was a really moving moment where the people asked the commissioners to sort of pick up the water. So I guess I'm curious if you have any more sort of general insights or other anecdotes with kind of like on the latter, like is fatigue potentially useful, or is it purely an obstacle? Because in Alex's remarks too, we were sort of thinking about climate fatigue, and it's always like, how do you keep people, sort of caring about something they know is really important, but is so big and abstract and seems so insurmountable. And that's fine if that's what fatigue is in this case, but I'm curious if you have other thoughts on how it might be more like that labor example as well.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that question. That's such I won't pretend to have like a good answer, because I think it is sort of an open question for me, like fatigue is obstacle versus catalyst or, tool. In terms of water, what comes to mind is this, sort of earlier when the crisis first came to light. I don't know if you remember the pipes, and something they started asking residents to do early on when it was acknowledged there was a problem was they had a Flush for Flint campaign. They asked everybody to run their taps for 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night. And it was really just like they needed water to be flowing through the pipes to basically clear them out, like kind of clear that particulate matter and sediment. And that became I remember that as a huge controversy. And it was very interesting because people said, well, we're not going to pay for our water just to be running to fix the mistakes that, the water treatment plant should be treating the water. Like this shouldn't be offloaded to the residents. So I think that wasn't necessarily a big dramatic moment like the sit down strike. It didn't necessarily disrupt water infrastructure, politics and power in a huge way. But there was, I very much remember this, back and forth. And then they were like, well, there is sort of like a negotiation. The state was like, well, we'll credit you for, flushing, like we'll take a portion of your water bill out. And it was just this ongoing conversation, right? It never really ended. It just was this ongoing, well, wait, why is it our responsibility to flush for Flint? And, why are we going to pay to fix a problem we didn't create that we are kind of unjustly suffering from? So I guess moments like that come to mind, and I'm not sure if, I still have a lot to think about what fatigue means in this kind of political mode, but I love that question.
Thank you both.